And maybe we can just zoom back out and become a bit more familiar with this term osteosarcopenia, because I'm sure a lot of coaches listening in and practitioners familiar with osteoporosis, sarcopenia. Can you tie that connection in a little bit more clearly for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of the listeners will be familiar with, as you mentioned, the term osteopenia or osteoporosis. So that was defined over back in, when was it, 1980, as the age-related loss of bone. It causes fragility to bone and predisposes to fractures. But then more recently, in 2015, sarcopenia has come to light. So it was actually first coined back in 1990 by a gentleman, Dr. Erwin Rosenberg, and sarcopenia is the Greek words for flesh loss. But then that's come to light that sarcopenia actually is a clinical condition that also causes falls and fractures. So sarcopenia is to muscle, while osteoporosis is to bone. So it's the weakening, the loss of muscle mass, and then the weakening of that contractile proteins that predisposes to falls and fractures. Now we have a group of patients a subset of patients that actually have both of the conditions, and it's been termed recently as Osteo-Sarcopenia. And this is both the impact on an individual's mobility and quality of life, and the impact on healthcare expenditure is ginormous with this condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, with the aging population, I mean, we're seeing about a doubling over the next 20 or 30 years, 2 billion people by the year 2050 estimations. Obviously, as you mentioned, greater number of falls, fractures, hospitalizations, even just increased risk factors for other conditions. If we look at root causes here, some of the pathophysiology of osteosarcopenia, between genetics, between just having that physical load, protein turnover, hormonal factors. Can you touch on a few of those and explain how they would potentially be implicated with osteosarcopenia?
Yeah, definitely. So when we look at risk factors, well, we know that advancing age and getting older is a risk factor for every disease under the sun, and that's just
Yeah.
because, and that's because
We can slow aging, but we can't reverse it yet, right?
exactly, yeah, every organ deteriorates to some degree, if it be your heart, your muscle, your bone, lung capacity, etc. So obviously, advancing age is a risk factor for this condition. And then more environmental factors would be physical inactivity or reduction in physical activity, and then poor nutritional status or malnutrition. And when we talk about those nutrients, we think of what you need for your muscles in terms of protein, and then we think in terms of what you need for your bone, which is both calcium and vitamin D. Um, and a reduction in those nutrients over time will predispose to both sarcopenia and osteoporosis because of the role of these nutrients play. But the overarching one here is physical inactivity. And if you looked on a graph, what happens to your muscle and bone mass over time, that would show a linear decrease. So when we talk in terms of, let's focus on bone here for a second, we know you have two types of bone. We have the trabecular, the one inside, the spongy type, and then you have the cortical bone on the outside. And these both decrease across the lifespan. And you can lose by age 80 up to 50% of your overall bone mineral density. And obviously, that predisposes then to a fall and a fracture. Now, at the same time, your muscle mass and strength goes down as well after about the third decade of life. That's around 1% per year for muscle mass. And then they're about somewhere between 2 and 3% per year of muscle strength loss. So it's a bit more accelerated. So if you had a graph, like I mentioned, and you looked at muscle mass, muscle strength, and the amount of bone an individual has, that line would just be slowly going down across the lifespan. But when we hit around the fourth or fifth decade of life, so let's say a middle-aged adult, that's when it begins to creep up a little bit. And that is just because the obvious one is people are become more inactive in their day-to-day life during that period. And then again, that'll hit at a higher threshold. So that line will go down again linearly when we around age 60 up to age 80. And again, that is because we are more inactive, there's poor nutritional status, and then individuals become institutionalized. So either they might have a period hospitalization, where they could be bed bound, and they could be, even during that period, you could be losing a lot more muscle, and to a degree some bone as well. So then again, it predisposes you to osteosarcopenia. Or you could be in a care home somewhere, a care home facility where there's low activity levels. We know that in those care homes, and the nutrition isn't the best either. So you're lacking those nutrients, which we talk about. So really, the main ones are aging, are physical inactivity, and poor nutrition. And then you have other factors as well, which we know now. And one of them is fat infiltration of both bone, inside the bone marrow, and inside the muscle fibers and around the muscle fibers. So, in the opposite direction to what happens with your muscle mass, your strength, and your bone as it goes down across the lifespan, we've actually shown now, different groups around the world, that fat infiltration actually goes up across the lifespan. And that fat inside the tissue can actually break down the healthy muscle cells and the bone cells at doing their job properly. So turning over every day and holding on to the contractile protein, or be it the bone density of that tissue. And that's actually independent as well of obesity levels. So if you have abdominal obesity, let's say, fat infiltration of muscle and bone is actually a risk factor for falls and for a fracture or a fall, independent of your overall obesity. So it seems to be this very specific type of fat infiltration that's definitely creeping into different organs, and in osteosarcopenia, that is apparent also. Now,
And Ben, if I jump in quickly, is that something that one might see with certain conditions, or are there other factors there associated with that infiltration or comorbidities?
well, again, yes, there could be some comorbidities that accelerate that. So, but again, that could be, so sarcopenia is prevalent in individuals that have different comorbidities, diabetes, cancer, and so on. But actually, that is a natural process as well that we found in the natural population. It goes up, but again, it's accelerated in different circumstances. And that's all we know really about that fat filtration at the moment. So then we talk about, I mentioned as well, other secondary causes of osteosarcopenia. Like I mentioned, it could be comorbidities or other diseases. It could be things like corticosteroid use is definitely a risk factor. So the medication corticosteroids for both bone loss and muscle loss, and that is because it's shown to increase myostatin in both tissues, and then myostatin can lead to protein degradation, breakdown in muscle over time, and a reduction in bone forming cells. So the osteoblasts doing their job on bone that keep it turning over and maintain the bone density. And then you'll have the hormone decreases as well. So the different sex hormones, testosterone in men, hypogonadism, so low testosterone levels is a risk factor for the loss of muscle mass and bone as well, both tissues simultaneously. And then obviously in females, you have a decline in estrogen levels.
Yeah, it's interesting how, in midlife, you think of maybe in the 40s, if people have a young family, work is busy, all of a sudden the exercise component starts to be, there's a lack of time, and so exercise tends to get sacrificed. The nutrition becomes more challenging as well with this lack of time, and all of a sudden when people get into their 50s, these become habits, and the nutrition isn't on point. There's a lack of activity. As you mentioned, there's going to be changes in hormones, whether it's perimenopausal, menopausal women with estrogen declines, whether it's men who simply, lack of sleep, busy, stressful lives. We can start to see that testosterone lowering as well. We're sort of setting ourselves up for an increased risk of some of these factors. And, you talked about these, various primary, secondary factors. In your paper, you talk about this muscle and bone crosstalk via things like the myokines, osteokines, adipokines. Can you dive into that a little more with listeners?
Yeah, so basically on a very basic level of muscle and bone biology, we know that mesenchymal stem cells, so muscle cells, myocytes, which are called myocytes, and bone cells, which are osteoblasts, they both come from the same adult stem cell. So the genetic and the biological underpinning of the stem cell, or sorry, the myocytes, the muscle cells, and the osteoblasts that come from that, they have some crossover. So they have some similarities. And most of this data, when we look at the crosstalk between muscle and bone cells, has been done in rodent models. That is a limitation of it, and that's something we need to look more at in human models. But they have shown in different circumstances that there's a number of growth factors and factors that break down as well that come from bone to muscle and impact it, and then vice versa, that get released through muscle fibers. Something like IL-6, interleukin-6, for instance, after exercise has both a autocrine and paracrine effect. So IL-6 will, when it's released by muscle, it will act on the muscle fiber as well to do a number of different things in energetics. And then at the same time, it can actually crosstalk to the bone and activate a number of factors there, i.e. an increase in bone density. So when we think of how physical activity, for instance, loading the muscle or bone through weightlifting or resistance exercise, whichever one you want to call it, we know that that weight, by contracting the muscle, will then stimulate bone forming, so will vibrate off the bone and stimulate bone forming cells as well. But we know there's definitely some crosstalk locally as well as some other factors that happen. And this is probably best illustrated by studies that if you took a bone tissue and a fractured tissue, and then you put muscle flaps over that, the bone tissue, the fracture, will heal faster when you put the muscle flaps over it. So that
Incredible.
suggests there that definitely the muscle cells, the myocytes, are doing something. They're talking to the bone and they're speeding up that recovery. So when we think of the pathophysiology of osteosarcopenia, like I mentioned, you have risk factors, your age, poor nutrition, low physical activity, some genetic factors as well, like the vitamin D receptor, polymorphisms in the vitamin D receptor, both in muscle and bone, they might be causing as well. But then the other factor is what you're mentioned here, and this is crosstalk between these cells released by muscle and bone tissue and how they talk to each other and vice versa. But again, it's early days with that, and it is just in rodent models that we've been able to investigate this in preclinical studies. So it's a really fascinating area of research, but we are learning more about all these endocrine cells that talk to each other and paracrine, autocrine responses on both tissues. And we do think it has a key role as well in the pathophysiology of this condition.